Sometimes it seems like God works in the weirdest ways. We've talked before about God's work in Providence and how God makes things happen for us in our daily lives in weird and unexpected ways. It's important to know this idea of providence has biblical roots. Sometimes the work of evil and God's great work happens in ways that don't seem safe to us, in ways that don't seem practical. You don't want to have the entire world's salvation depend on this smallest little thread, do you? Well, if you're God, yes. Sometimes God allows the salvation of the entire world to hang on the slightest thread. I'm thinking here especially of the story of the patriarch Joseph from the Old Testament. Joseph is the great-great-great-grandson of Abraham. He is the son of Jacob, who's named Israel. He's one of the original 12 sons of Israel, the 12 tribes of Israel being named after those 12 sons of Israel, of Jacob. Well, the story of Jacob you might be familiar with from plays or things like that, but I'm not sure the plays and the musicals always get this fascinating part and this illuminating part of the way God works in salvation history and the way God works in our own lives. You see, Joseph, of course, was abandoned and betrayed by his brothers. He's a Christ figure in that way, and he's sold into slavery in Egypt. And it's as a slave in Egypt that we get to the point of how our salvation hangs on a thread. So Joseph was wearing an Egyptian garment, and one day in the house of Potiphar, under whom Joseph worked, Potiphar's wife made an advance on Joseph, and Joseph denied her, but in the process she clung on his garment and pulled it away from him. That became the evidence for her lie to accuse Joseph of attempting to violate her, which saw Joseph getting thrown into prison. Now, it's in prison, a very difficult and sad situation, that Joseph met the stewards of Pharaoh's household, his cook and his butler. Now, the butler's restored to Pharaoh's graces, and it's some 10 years afterwards, while Joseph is suffering in prison, that the butler remembers that Joseph could interpret dreams. So when Pharaoh has troubling dreams that no one can interpret, the butler says, "I remember a guy," and they go to Joseph in prison. Joseph interprets the dreams and is brought into good graces. But not just that, of course, he interprets the dreams about famine. There's going to be 7 rich years of crops and 7 famine years that follow, the 7 fat cows, the 7 skinny cows. Well, because Pharaoh follows Joseph's advice and makes him the second of command of the entire kingdom of Egypt, Egypt has grain, Egypt has food. So where do Joseph's brothers and his father go for help when they're in famine? That's right, to Egypt. Now, they don't know, of course, that Joseph is their brother, that this has been the fate of their brother Joseph. And so the 70 Jewish people, the only 70 Jews in the world in that time, are saved because Joseph is in that spot. And how is Joseph in that spot? Because some Egyptian tailor cut corners, used cheap thread, didn't use sound techniques, whatever it was. Joseph was in that spot because he was in prison. He was in prison because Potiphar's wife could make accusations against him, and she could make accusations against him because when she clung at his garment, it tore away in his hands because of that shoddy Egyptian tailor. Now, in our own lives, grace, God's providence, God's gifts sometimes happens in similar ways. So when we're in the midst of one of those trials, maybe we're in the midst of something that feels like prison, we shouldn't complain, we shouldn't begrudge our assistance too much, but rather trust God, turn to God and say, okay, Lord, maybe you're going to use this suffering, this apparent evil for some good. And of course, that shows the great mastery of God. Only God can use some evil, some loss for some good. He doesn't want that evil, he doesn't want that loss, he doesn't want Joseph to suffer, but he can use it for his good, to save the Jewish people, and from the Jewish people to bring up the Christ, and through the Christ to save all peoples of every race and tongue. So whenever we think about God's plan for our life, let's remember that sometimes his plan might be in ways we do not expect, but through it all, let's trust him. I'm Father Andrew Dickinson at the Pius XII Catholic Newman Center. I love you. God bless you. Have a great week.